The thought of your spouse being unfaithful is one that most of us dread, but something that unfortunately seems to happen often. Rachel Cooks had lived with her grandmother in a small town in Minsk that had long been famous for its dense forest, rivers, and lakes. As a little girl, she had fallen in love with nature. Rachel liked to swim in the lake and wander the winding forest paths, dreaming that one day it would lead her to a fairy tale castle where beyond the walls a handsome prince awaited her. The girl had no memory of her mother, and by the time she came of age, she considered her grandmother the closest and dearest person in the world. Mrs. Cooks, trying not to break her granddaughter's heart, preferred not to remind Rachel that her mother had died during childbirth, and that her father had abandoned them long before the girl was born. That's how they lived, always understanding each other and supporting one another through everything. That was, of course, until the time mercilessly came for Mrs. Cooks, as it inevitably comes for everyone. The old woman was hospitalized with complications after a chronic illness. She never came back out, dying just a few days before her birthday. Rachel's grief was immeasurable. The unfortunate girl became an orphan at just under 20 years old. She chose not to give up, though, and continued to keep her home in perfect order, trying to keep everything just as it was when her grandmother was still alive. Rachel, at the time, had no boyfriend. This was likely due to her innate modesty, coupled with the good upbringing that her grandmother had provided her. Quite a few young men had tried and failed in their attempts to woo Rachel. She simply smiled at each of her suitors' shabby advances, making their hearts beat with renewed vigor. No relationship would come out of this, though. When Jordan appeared in town, though, Rachel's life was flipped on its head. It wasn't that he was a handsome fellow or some seductive womanizer. No, it was the lad's character that drew the lonely orphan in. Jordan turned out to be a good guy and immediately turned his attention to the modest beauty, setting himself on the goal of winning her heart. Jordan was from out of town and came from the big city where he had been thoroughly annoying to his parents. His parents, as wealthy businessmen, had deliberately exiled him to his distant relatives in a provincial town in order to knock him down a notch and moderate his ardor. Seeing Rachel at the supermarket, Jordan had no hesitations. He approached her and immediately offered for her to come to the movies with him in the evening. Rachel was stunned, and her provincial beauty and confusion yielded to Jordan's bold approach, agreeing to go with him that night. Rachel, for the first time in a long time, felt happy. Jordan came to the date with a bouquet of roses and appeared before her as a gallant gentleman, showering her with compliments. So after that memorable evening, Jordan and Rachel began seeing more of each other every day, and with each meeting they got closer and closer. After that, Rachel began to think she would become Jordan's wife. Unfortunately, deep down, Jordan didn't share those feelings. He preferred to lead a wild and uncommitted lifestyle. News of Rachel's pregnancy sobered the lovers up who had been so mad with passion for so long. The naive provincial girl thought that this would mean marriage was around the corner, but as it turned out, Jordan didn't have that in his plans. Instead, he would try to get rid of her by leaving her in the forest with predators. He put a plan for leaving her inside the snake's pit, but God's will would not allow this. I think we shouldn't see each other anymore. I'm not ready to be a father, and I'm not ready to look into the eyes of my disappointed friends and family, Jordan said, and almost immediately abandoned the girl for whom he had claimed to have had such a genuine love for not so long ago. After his words, he left her with a giant snake. But luckily, a brave old man saved her life. Rachel felt tears build up in her eyes. The girl had such romantic ideals and did not expect such cruelty from someone so close and beloved to her, much less leave her without another word. Rachel wandered home, struggling not to burst into tears in the middle of the forest. Jordan left with his new girlfriend and spread more rumors about Rachel, saying she was like a snake and how he had been lured into performing satanic rituals with her. He had been seduced by a supposedly unapproachable provincial beauty. Meanwhile, Rachel, just like her mother once, was left alone and abandoned by a boy who was afraid of the responsibility of being a father to his child. Embarrassed by her growing belly from day to day, the unfortunate orphan constantly felt the unkind looks of the town people who considered her a promiscuous, evil girl. Often in the evenings, Rachel wept. She looked at a picture of her mother, who had died in childbirth and didn't have time to enjoy the happiness of motherhood. It was becoming unbearable for the pregnant, abandoned girl, who was humiliated and had tried to be disposed of by being thrown into the snake pit in the forest. In the supermarket, women pointed fingers at Rachel and smiled snidely, exchanging obscene rumors. Unable to endure the taunts and mockery, she gathered her modest belongings and bought a ticket to Bangor, arriving in one of the largest neighborhoods of the city. Rachel got a job in a sewing factory and was determined to start her life over. Of course, initially, the girl had to sleep in cheap hostels and roadside hotels until she found a place in the dormitory intended for factory employees. Rachel only had an old laptop with her that she used to do 3D modeling, a fantastic pastime that eventually became her hobby and a source of additional income. She was still far from being a real programmer, but she was not discouraged and she honed her skills daily. Over time, Rachel finished her 3D design courses and decided to change jobs after graduation. Since she was too far into her pregnancy to continue working in a factory, Rachel had to stop. She sent out her resume to all the offices in the city without exception and waited patiently for an invitation to work. One day, an offer came from the office of a company that created 3D models of products for online stores. After the interview, Rachel, despite her pregnancy, was hired to work remotely. The determined girl latched onto the job like a drowning man onto a life ring. She spent days and nights in front of her laptop screen. She took any work that would bring her any money whatsoever, no matter how meager. Even the birth of her little son, who the happy mother named Peter, couldn't stop her from being creative. Rachel refused to go on maternity leave. She tapped at the keys of her laptop, meeting deadline after deadline, order after order that she had been receiving from the head of the firm. Any other girl would have probably given up and gone back to the provincial town, but not Rachel, who had burned her old bridges and wasn't willing to return to the condemning eyes of her quote-unquote friends. 7 years of good and bad work flew by as if it were a mere 24 hours. Rachel's diligence and innate talent were noticed by her firm's director, who appointed her head of the department. It's hard to even imagine what incredible effort this provincial girl had to endure to achieve this position, one that all of the firm's employees had dreamed of. Now, she is referred to as Miss Cooks by her subordinates. They respectfully admire her talent in 3D modeling and her stellar business acumen. Now, Rachel's mornings begin with a cup of coffee and a review of the previous day's reports provided by her personal secretary. While his mother continued to climb the career ladder, little Peter lived in the house Miss Cooks had bought with the money from a loan she had taken out. All the while, the boy was being looked after by a nanny whom Rachel had hired to take care of him. Because of the nature of her job, Miss Cooks often had to use the services of airlines, flying from one side of the country to the other. Hence, it was this time, too, when Rachel had the honor of traveling to Chicago, where she was to make a presentation at the firm's headquarters. Miss Cooks boarded the cab to take her to the airport with a folder of business papers and a nod to the driver. Rachel concentrated on reading the papers to make good use of her free time to prepare her report. Suddenly, the woman felt the gaze of the cab driver who, without the slightest embarrassment, openly looked at her from head to toe. Rachel looked up and said in a surprised tone, "Jordan? Is that you? What are you doing here?" she asked, holding the gaze of the man who had broken her heart 7 years ago. "Well, I'm glad you recognize me. What am I doing? Well, as you can see, I'm working," And look at you, a real businesswoman," Jordan said in admiration, skillfully maneuvering in the stream of cars flooding the streets. Hearing his last words, Rachel noticed herself thinking that deep down, she had absolutely no feelings for her former lover. For a long time, Jordan spoke about his father's company going bankrupt after he had died from a stroke. But his words didn't resonate with Rachel's soul. They sounded unnatural and contrived. "Maybe I should tell him about our son," she thought, glancing at Jordan inquiringly. Still, when her ex-boyfriend, after letting out a dirty joke, suggested that he and Rachel try all over again, the answer she'd been nurturing for those long, difficult 7 years instantly came to mind. "No, Jordan. There's no reason for us to dredge up the past and reanimate something that's been dead for so long. Sorry, but I needed you 7 years ago. When I dreamed of marriage and a child together, you were so eager to live a free life. After getting it, you now look to me for help and support. Goodbye, Jordan. I have no time. I'm late for my flight," Rachel said. She parted and paid for the fare, leaving Jordan with a good tip, clutching the bills in his hands. The driver looked after the elegantly dressed woman whose sincere feelings he had so cynically abused years ago. Jordan sadly sighed and opened the door for another customer, trying to banish that intrusive feeling that was creeping up on him. He realized he had ruined his chance for a family life, all because he had made no room for Rachel and their child in his heart.